For our next speaker, we're bringing back Dr. Erik Antonsen. This time, Erik is going to talk about the 10th Achieving Mars workshop, which we held back in December. And the Achieving Mars workshops we've been having since 2013, bringing all the different stakeholders together from architecture, science, and other elements. This particular time, we brought human health specialists in, and I think to a degree that few other groups have done in the past. And so Erik's going to go over the results of the report, which we are actually officially releasing next week. But of course, you will all receive a copy, and Erik will give you the overview of what the findings we found. So thank you, Erik.
Thank you. Ooh, thank you. So, oh, great, it works. What you see up here right now is the front page for the report that will be coming out, as Chris mentions, next week. And when we were working on this, I've been involved with the Achieving Mars workshops for about 3 years now, and somehow managed to keep showing up, but also getting more and more responsibility. So I got pushed into being a co-chair, and you can see my other co-chairs there. Bruce Jakowski is a planetary scientist, and Lisa May is an engineer who works for Lockheed Martin, and I want to make sure I acknowledge all their work on this. I was the one who was able to be here on this particular day and brief out what we talked about. As Chris said, this is the first time that we really started to try to pull together the expertise in human health and performance with the engineering, the architecture, and the groups that have typically contributed to these over the last 10 years that these events have occurred. And so I want to make sure I acknowledge how many people were there. And they really broke down into about 3 different groups, right? We had the scientists, oftentimes in terms of planetary science, planetary protection, these sort of things. We brought in scientists from the human and the biology side as well. And interestingly, that they keep referring to each other as the other scientists. We had the human health and performance experts that were there, and we had a large showing of folks who are engineers who have worked on the engineering side of this equation for a long time. And a lot of it I have to attribute to Michelle Rucker, who works at NASA and is the lead for the Mars Integration Group. She was saying, hey, we've been working on this for a long time. It's time to bring in more of the human specialists. And I just think to myself, well, great, you brought the humans to this thing. The way I want to kind of frame this, because if I do my job well, then at the end of this, everybody's going to be mad at me, right? NASA will feel like we're giving recommendations, then saying maybe they had not seen some things, but I was inside of NASA, and I was always in the position of having to struggle with how to frame what we're doing to the outside, to the public, and talk about the limitations that we have. Also now being outside of NASA, I look in and I see some of the challenges that the bureaucracy faces, and I want to say, hey, there's ways that we can do this better. So what you see up here right now is a passage from Safe Passage, which was a book that NASA went to the National Academies to produce back in the late 90s, and it was published in 2001. And at that time, we were looking forward to the International Space Station. How are we going to make this transition from the 2-week missions of the space shuttle out to 3 months, 6 months, 1 year in microgravity and in human spaceflight? Because the way that NASA had grown up had been inside of engineering. The challenges of getting to low Earth orbit were oftentimes much more immediate than the challenges of staying in low Earth orbit. And so the culture grew up around engineering at NASA, and sometimes working on the inside, either in the sciences and space biology or in human health and performance, it's a challenge to get the countermeasures that we think are important, the science that we think is important to be done. It's a challenge to get them rolled into projects. And so we met, and that was in December, and then as you see here at the bottom of that, this thing came out in March of 2024, which actually answered a lot of the recommendations that we came up with. So it turns out, awkwardly, that while we were at the Achieving Mars workshop, NASA sent some folks, Jake Bleacher among them, to tell us, hey, by the way, we've got a new process in place. We've got this architecture concept review, and we want you all to come and give input as scientific communities through this process. And we said, wow, that was one of the recommendations we were going to make. So good job. You're already on top of it. And then this was published. And it became clear that NASA is changing direction in how they approach architecture. And we weren't all aware of this. As a matter of fact, this is one of those challenges in communication that sometimes NASA does really good and amazing things and they might not have shared it enough. So you heard some of this earlier from some of the NASA folks. And you heard about how that architecture concept review is working, that in November they have a once annual meeting where they're asking for that input from the community and trying to have the conversation that sometimes we haven't had in the past as we've struggled with budget and timing and scheduling. But as they look forward to Mars and have created the Moon to Mars office and now have created an approach to conceptualize the architecture differently, you can feel some of the change in the air. So this is also something that they showed earlier. And one of the big challenges that we found when we were at the Achieving Mars workshop was how do we get the science truly to be integrated and appreciated by the engineering community? It's also the same concern that we had on the human side. It seems like over the 70 years of history that one of the NASA folks showed earlier with all of these conceptual reviews for how to get to Mars and how to make the vehicles, that we had figured out how to get there and we had designed something that could be there, and then as an afterthought, the question was, now let's stuff in the humans and sprinkle in some science because we've designed all this great stuff. So to see this on their list of why we explore, the science portions of this is immensely rewarding, and it was something that we were going to push on an awful lot. You have to start at the beginning, which is why are you going? Science, inspiration, and national posture. And from that, then you can start to derive what is going to be needed. So we have these objectives, and if you look closely at them, a little bit more than half of them are science enabling. Different types of science, but as was noted by earlier speakers, getting to that conversation about, wait a second, how do we whittle this down to what we're actually going to do is a challenge. The conversation doesn't happen at the level of massive conferences. It happens at the level of requirements and system specs. When somebody says, oh, we want this much resolution, and the engineer says, oh, wow, that would take 250 satellites around Mars to do that, that's not realistic. So a part of this is applauding the science, but also making some recommendations on how we can take those next steps to get to those recommendations. One of the things that is supremely useful in this process that NASA has laid out is to architect from the right. And architect from the right means starting with that goal. Okay, if the science is really as important as you say it is, and we can have some discussions about what science will prioritize, but let's assume that some of these astronauts are going to go down to the surface of Mars and they're going to be doing some geology at least. They're going to need to be walking around the surface. You're starting to define tasks that need to be fulfilled. And one of the biggest challenges on the human side of the equation has been, if you don't define the tasks ahead of time, then it's really hard for us to determine what it's going to take to ensure that the humans are fit enough to do those tasks. And by fit enough, it's the same thing that we were talking about earlier in our conversation. Are they cognitively fit? Are they physically fit? Have you designed the rovers and the suits in such a way that a human can actually function within them? So this breakdown is something that we also saw and said, wow, we were going to say something like that too. Now, I showed this earlier, and this is part of the reason why architecting from the right is so important, because we no longer can rely on the advantages that we've had in low Earth orbit. Fundamental things change. 3 of them, the real-time communications, can we evacuate and how long will it take? And can we talk to mission control? And how do we talk to them? Those things are changing in ways that we've never had to deal with before. So you cannot take the solutions of yesterday and pretend that you're going to get to our destination of tomorrow. And throughout this process, as we noted in some of the earlier talks, the increasing exposure to the hazards and the increasing deconditioning that astronauts face living in microgravity on the way there means that that cognitive fitness and that physical fitness may be challenged, and may be challenged significantly beyond what we've experienced. Because if you keep in mind that The shortest Mars mission that we're talking about at NASA is 730 days. The longest that any one human has ever spent in space at one time was 438 days. It was a Russian cosmonaut. We have a handful of data points at around a year, and we've got a couple hundred in the 6-month domain. So we're asking our crews to become more autonomous and better functionally at a time when this entire environment around them is trying to degrade their capabilities. And this is the real thing that I think when we talk about taking away mission control, that people don't realize just how much is there. There are 22 unique console disciplines. They've got hundreds of years of experience, not just on the consoles themselves, but with back rooms that are monitoring, that are doing analysis, that are breaking down all the possibilities of things that are happening, and that are giving crew the information they need to maintain and repair those vehicles, habitats, and suits that are keeping them alive. So when you start taking this away and the real-time guidance that comes with it, you come to a place where you have to ask, if we spend billions of dollars sending 4 people to Mars, how are we going to stuff all of that education, knowledge, and experience into the brains of 4 people? The answer is we're not. We have to architect it into the system. We have to be able to design the systems that can meet those people where they're at. And we've also have challenges with the science of understanding that breakdown, understanding and characterizing the humans in space. You might think after 24 years of operating the space station that we have characterized the human experience in microgravity. I'm sorry to disappoint you. It's been less than 700 people that have ever flown in space. If I do a drug trial, I'm looking for at least 3,000 participants. So we're still learning an immense amount. Whenever any of these systems, any mission, any program goes through from formulation to implementation, they always go through some version of this, which is the systems engineering life cycle. And those 70 years of concepts and architectures and things that we're learning from all occurred in the pre-phase A concept studies domain. But there's so much more that happens after that. The challenge that we face is that for most of NASA's history, the first time that we've heard the words human system integration in that process occurred at a milestone called Systems Requirements Review, which was far into phase A and almost to phase B. What that means is that all the requirements for the system were written, and then somebody said, now let's go figure out how to integrate the humans. And that was not a very effective way of doing things because we've had to go back and fix a lot of stuff. And if a Mars mission is going to cost trillions of dollars, we cannot be going back and fixing a lot of stuff. The science and the human systems integration has to be influencing and partnered with the engineering every step of the way. So when you start doing that, when you wait until systems requirements review, that milestone that I just pointed out, you've probably committed maybe 60% of your costs for the entire mission. The longer you wait to go fix those things that you didn't design well from the beginning, because maybe you didn't bring all the experts in, the much more it costs to extract those things. Here it's calling them extracting defects. We lived this with the space station. We didn't design the acoustic engineering up front. And in 2003, there's a front page Los Angeles Times article that talks about how the commander of the space station couldn't hear himself think and couldn't communicate with his colleagues. So we spent millions and millions of dollars going back and making installments of quieter fans and quieter turbo pumps. We can't afford to do that for a mission to Mars. So part of our getting to Mars is, hey, groups like SpaceX showed how to decrease costs in the launch domain. Our job now is to decrease costs on the back end by getting that architecting from the right correct. So here's a couple of recommendations that we made after we went to the ACR and started participating in it. One is that once a year for input from the larger science and technical communities that are outside of NASA, is probably not enough. It's really hard to come into a once-a-year meeting and give meaningful interaction, especially when you're getting updated on what they did over the last year. So part of our ask is not necessarily create, but at least support new and more frequently recurring public interactive forums that have the explicit goal of putting inputs into the architecture definition document. If you go out there and support the groups of experts like the MEPAG and other groups that have been mentioned before, they're very excited to help with this. They can happen in places where you don't have to spend tons of money creating an entire conference for it. You could branch off from other conferences. But we need more communication to have these conversations because it's oftentimes feels like a one-way street if we're just doing it once a year. The second one, and my SMD colleagues, the Science Mission Directorate colleagues, might look at me cross-eyed for this one, but acknowledge and address the tension between scientific investment that goes for human risk mitigation and the investment for discovery science when you're planning for Moon to Mars missions. So let me make sure I frame what these are. In the human research program, it's been an applied research program, as Dr. McPhee has pointed out several times today. So their job is to go figure out what the risks are and burn them down. One of the things that didn't happen well along the way was collecting the ambient data about the environment and the state of the people so that we could understand and draw conclusions from retroactive studies of that information. And so we're asking to design in, prioritize the sensors and the data capabilities to actually capture this information. Most of the investments that the Human Research Program has made to date are hypothesis-driven, focused on trying to answer one narrow thing. But as we enter into the era of artificial intelligence and machine learning, having much larger databases of what the environment looked like, what's the state of your crew in that environment, how are they functioning, what are their error rates, these sort of things, is a broad part of how we're going to learn new things about how humans are either adapting to spaceflight or how they are maladapting. Is it pathologic? For many of the things that we're studying, we're not sure yet. Both NASA and commercial companies are looking at Mars exploration at this point, and evolvable and flexible campaign architectures are going to be a key part of this. It's really challenging to look at designs of the past that, if you think about what happened with the space shuttle, they had to go back on eBay to find equipment to keep the space shuttle running. And this is something that, if you have a long life of a program, it's going to be to some extent a reality, right? But part of the concept of making the medical systems or some of the other systems into a plug-and-play domain, or setting the standards for how data should actually be moving back and forth for science, for maintenance and repair, for all these things, is to try to lean into recognizing the fact that technology changes. And if you design for one thing 1 year, you're really going to hamstring your ability to continue to utilize the new and evolving technology of tomorrow, especially when those things are shrinking. The size of the first ultrasound on the International Space Station was an entire rack. The size of the one that's up there right now is a laptop. The size of the one we couldn't get up there because of some of the restrictions, the Butterfly, is a probe that plugs into your iPhone. So SpaceX took it up. So that pace of technological change that actually allows us to collect the information from the operational or the scientific perspective is something that has to be planned for. And it's probably a demand that NASA needs to make, that the companies that are supplying it aren't just relying on proprietary things to maximize their input, but open source. And then for recommendation 4, and this one, it looks like from the architecture definition document that they're already really trying to work on this, right? How do you investigate the pathways, partnering with the commercial companies to invest in those lunar capabilities and technologies that are Mars forward? So for many of us who have spent years working in and around NASA, one of the challenges was always that the problem of today was boxing out the planning for tomorrow. It's nice to think about a Mars mission, but we really have to focus on the mission today. And that means getting this thing up there because it's the cheapest and the fastest, not because it's multimodal and forward-looking. And so the agency is starting to make that cultural change at this time, and it's something that the entire group wanted to encourage and say, hey, this is really, when we have a Moon to Mars office, they need to have the authority, in addition to just the responsibility, to ensure that the things that are being done in the Artemis campaign at the Moon are truly Mars forward. That is where we are going to learn about partial gravity and start to learn about the dose response curve. How do our muscles and our bodies respond in these partial gravity environments? Is it enough to stop things like SANS to have 1/6 gravity? What about the 3/8 gravity of Mars? We don't know yet, and we're not going to know until we go and try these things. But making sure that the technologies and capabilities that we've put forward in these are looking forward to Mars to be able to capture those things. So one of the things that happened when we were looking through the Moon to Mars objectives document, which is, let me put it this way. For those of you who are into reading something like this, it is fascinating, and it's amazing, and it's a great piece of work, and I love it. I noticed right here at page 8 and page 9 that we went from what are the reasons why we're going to how are we engineering the system. It skipped over some things. And so this is one of the gaps that I wanted to raise and think about and talk about, because one of the biggest challenges, as I mentioned from the safe passage process from earlier, was the culture is one of engineering. The culture is one where it's, let's solve this problem and move on to the next one. And you can have these conversations about requirements within the engineering community, but we're trying to broaden that conversation. So if I take what I see here in this document and I put it into Moon to Mars objectives and how am I interpreting this, then that architecting from the right says, why are we going? Well, we're going for the science, and we haven't completely sussed out what all of that is, but we're going to get there, and through some conversation with the engineering teams about what's realistic, then we can probably figure out, here's the science we're going to do, and here's the vehicles that are going to take us to do it. So what's the part that's missing? When I ask the question, what capabilities are required to do the science, when we talk about a human mission to Mars, the question is, who's doing the science? Because now we're starting to ask, it's not what capabilities do you design into these vehicles, these spacesuits and these habitats. We're starting to ask the question, what are the tasks that the humans are going to be asked? And what level of fitness do they need to have in order to perform them? So part of what we're missing here when we bifurcate this between we're going to put science up front and we're going to have them talk to the engineers is that squishy piece in the middle, which is the human. If you want to ask humans to pilot a vehicle, that implies a certain level of fitness, cognitive, functional, physical. If you want to ask humans to go out and do EVAs, which, by the way, are the most physically demanding tasks, and they are immensely demanding. There are oftentimes injuries when we do them in microgravity. And the thing about it is that, wow, we've actually in ISS, we typically have done no more than 5 EVAs outside of the ISS in any given crew member's 6-month mission. But now when we go to the moon, we're going to be asking people to do EVAs every day. So what does that imply in terms of their physical fitness? At a time when they've been deconditioning over 9 months of transit time, at a time when we're not even sure how much sparing to do in order to make sure that the treadmill works and that they can keep up their exercise, because if that breaks, they're probably not going to be in a physically fit domain to be able to do the jobs we're asking them to do when they get to Mars. So it's fundamental at this point. We are moving far enough, we are becoming audacious enough to look ahead and say, we're going to do these missions. We are starting to make the efforts to make sure that science is the cornerstone of why we're going. And that conversation with the scientific community has to improve from what it's been. We are also needing to start figuring out, how do we ask these questions? What do the humans need in order to accomplish the work that you are requiring of them when they get there? Because if they're not able to do the job, the mission is still a failure, even if you get them back. In the same way that Apollo 13 was a successful failure. We got them back, we didn't lose crew life, but we certainly lost the mission that we were doing. So this is where I want to leave it. That discussion, that conversation that you see here needs to wrap around that systems engineering process as an ongoing conversation between the scientists who are the reason for us going, the humans who are the mechanism by which we will do our job, and the engineers and the architecture teams who are helping to bound and figure out what's realistic and how do we actually achieve our goals. Because our goal, as this seminar is named, is humans to Mars. Thank you. I think I may be the only person who finished early.
There's time for maybe one or two questions.
Okay.
Probably one question.
Okay, Chris is saying I have time for one question if somebody has a question.
So how do you translate things?
We got a microphone.
So how do you translate things like, the big overarching architecture concepts and start distributing those big ideas to things like the EDL team, to the transit habitat team, to the science team? How do you start integrating all of those different elements, that you walk away from this to the people that actually have to execute?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Now, this is what you're talking about is a couple of entire disciplines, right? This is part of what systems engineering is figuring out, where do you start? How do you divvy up the work? How do you start flowing requirements down? And so in systems engineering, you start with these concepts and you go down and you come back up through a verification pathway. And you go all the way down to the level of specifying what aspects of the system need to be. The challenge is that systems engineering is massively important, but then there's another aspect of this, which is the human system integration. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I've run into while I was working at NASA is that there were many, many people who sort of thought they were the same thing. And they're really not. So part of it is doing that process of decomposing from a concept down to the level of requirements. Okay, we are going to Mars, and we are going to have a vehicle that can fly to Mars and one that can go land on Mars. And then those things are going to have these systems within them. You're going to have your avionics and your propulsion and your thermal, all right, all those things. So you break that down through a typical systems engineering process that admittedly is super complex, right? But that's why systems engineering as a discipline evolved. But you have to wrap that in constantly asking the question of design, right? And we all experience this in our lives when bad designs happen to good people, right? Cabinets are designed wrong, or your phone doesn't work right, or something like that. The human systems integration aspect of it is something that historically has been looked over, in part because we were still maturing it, the community practice was still maturing it, but also because it was good enough till now, and it's not going to be good enough for Mars. And I'm happy to talk more outside.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you very much, Erik.